So good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. To introduce myself, my name is Avani Kapur, and I'm a fellow at the Center for Policy Research, where I lead the Accountability Initiative. We're a research group within CPR and have been working on strengthening transparency and accountability to make it more responsive to citizen needs. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is track and study key social sectors to see how policies get translated into actual service delivery on the ground. Today, we're really excited to have you join us to launch our new learning tool called Mapping Governance. I think this specific tool has taken us nearly 2 years in the making, but in some ways, the genesis of the tool has been the beginning of our work. As someone not coming from within the government system, but trying to start work in a particular context, in a particular sector, we ended up spending quite some time in just trying to understand the government system. How much money does a panchayat actually have decision-making powers on? How do funds flow through the system? The formal and informal convergence and coordination mechanisms. So today we're really excited to be joined by a very esteemed panel. We have Dr. Sekhar Bonu, who's the Director General of the Development Monitoring and Evaluation Office in NITI Aayog. We have Mr. Sourabh Garg, the Chief Executive Officer, Unique Identification Authority of India. We have Ms. Uma Mahadevan, Principal Secretary, Panchayati Raj, Government of Karnataka. She'll be joining shortly. And Ms. Anjali Bhardwaj, founder of the Satark Nagrik Sangathan. And of course, Yamini Aiyar, President and Chief Executive CPR, who will be moderating the discussion. So to officially launch the tool and begin the discussions, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Rajika Seth. She's an associate fellow at Accountability Initiative and has been spearheading some of this work and brought together a lot of our research knowledge and evidence into something that is a little bit more dynamic and can be used as a learning mechanism. So over to you, Rajika.
But just thank you, Avani, and thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and looking forward to hearing what the speakers also have to say about the tool and just understanding and navigating government spaces in general. I will be sharing a quick PPT to give you a small demo of the tool, and so that you all have a sense of what we're talking about and what the tool looks like, and give you a glimpse of the tool. So it's called Mapping Governance, and it came from our own need to understand and navigate government systems and processes, like Avani was also saying. It is a visual, interactive, dynamic learning tool. And the way we've decided to go about it is because when we went into the ground, when I wanted to understand how education works, it was very difficult to understand what the BEO does and how the systems and structures come together. And I got asking my field team saying, explain it to me, let's start drawing it out. And similarly, in another instance where we were doing a workshop with panchayat secretaries, we asked them to draw out what they thought was the context and the space within which they worked. And so that really got us excited. And slowly, we started writing and building these organograms down. And so essentially what mapping governance is a set of organograms. We call them bundles. Each bundle comes with a state and sector combination. So one of the things we realized was that we wanted it to be issue-based. So nutrition, health, education versus department or scheme-based, because we wanted to try and see holistically how things come together. And as you can see, the tool is intended for everybody from government to academics, development professionals, anyone in media, policy advisory, public policy to actually make use of. So we've covered 5 themes in to kind of speak about the tool. So every tool, like I said, has a state and sector combination. So we are launching with nutrition for Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and Bihar. And soon we'll be coming out with tools for education, and again for the same states, Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, and Rajasthan. And each tool and each map will come with 5 themes. And these are the 5 pillars that we've tried to explore. The roles and responsibilities, decentralization, convergence and complications, fund flows, and social accountability. And I'm going to take you through each of these to give you a glimpse of what you could find in any of these themes within our tools. So one of the things that we cover in roles and responsibilities is really who sits where, who does what, how are decisions taken, which level do decisions take place in. And so think about it. Now think about the CDPO. The CDPO is a key official at the block level of the scheme ICDS, the Integrated Child Development Services, run by the WCD. So the CDPO is at the block level, but actually works within a larger framework of the women and child development, and is situated within that context. So not only does the CDPO interact with its own scheme related officials, but also with the larger, is part of the larger women and child development department as well. So state schemes as well. Then this is not the universe, this is not the entire universe of the CDPO, because nutrition as a service is actually one of the services that actually has a lot of allied sectors. So education has a role to play, health has a role to play, Gram Panchayat has a role to play, the Panchayati Raj has a role to play. So we decided we needed to see what that universe really looked like. And so when you go into roles and responsibilities, and when you go into the map that talks about this, you'll see literally the universe of what it looks like to deliver nutrition on the ground. And as you can see, we've tried to map levels as well as different departments that we felt were necessary to cover nutrition. And of course, nutrition is huge, so we tried to limit it to nutrition specific sectors versus nutrition sensitive departments. The next theme that we've kind of talked about is decentralization. So when we talk about decentralization, it's really the effective assignment of roles and responsibilities backed with resources and adequate staff to do those roles and responsibilities. And so one of the things that we wanted to see was, how does this decentralization actually play out on the ground? So if you see, we've tried to map the different the relationship between the Gram Panchayat at different levels and with the line departments, as you can see it. So in this case, a lot of the interaction that you will see is between the women and child development and the Gram Panchayat. And so if I were to give you one instance, one of the things that you will be able to see is how Gram Panchayats and the Gram Sabhas actually are involved with recruiting Anganwadi workers versus, however, they may not have a lot of power over their day-to-day functioning, and Anganwadi workers in general are accountable to their department. And so these kind of parallel structures and parallel bodies also make for interesting insights into how implementation takes place on the ground. And so these are one of the things that we also wanted to look at. Apart from looking within decentralization, the relationship between the local third tier of government and different departments, we also wanted to see how decentralized functioning works within departments and how decentralized decision making may be. So that's one of the other tracks that we have tried to cover within this theme. The third pillar, and one of the most interesting, that everybody finds most interesting, is around fund flows. So we all know that funds are a black box often, and this is what we've also been trying to unravel through a lot of our research work as well. So if I were to give you the instance of a school, for example, now schools need funding for all kinds of things, from infrastructure, water, sports, food, books, scholarships, etc. And one of the interesting things is that there are other sources of funding for schools apart from just the centrally sponsored schemes, for instance, the Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan. So there are different ways that, there are 15th Finance Commission grants, there are state schemes, there are other budget allocations that also play a huge role in funding different aspects of school functioning. And so we wanted to try and track that and map that on these maps as well. So what we did was something like this. So what are the different places where a school can actually get funding from? And I'm only showing you a snippet, but this goes all the way top to the state. So you are able to see the fund flow from the top to the bottom of how monies actually reach the last mile and the last and schools. So this is the theme on fund flows. The next theme that we wanted to try and cover was on social accountability. And one of the things that we realized is that, like, citizen engagement is at the heart of service delivery, and therefore it was important to track that as and make that an important pillar in our research. So we've tracked social accountability in two ways. One, we've tried to look at public grievance redressal systems and what are some of those channels. So whether it is the MP door or the elected representative door one might want to knock at, or whether it is going through the government functionaries it's responsible, or whether it's actually approaching committees that are made for these purposes that are joint between government and citizens in some ways. So one of the things we wanted to look at was grievance redressals and grievance redressal channels and how it actually gets implemented on the ground. So for instance, for nutrition, you'll see Rogi Kalyan Samitis are at every level of literally of governance in the system, and actually have members who join from various different departments. The other aspect that we wanted to look at was citizen engagement in planning and implementation and monitoring and evaluation and all of these other things. And so we wanted to map out some of the development partners, which is what we've tried to do. So if there were partners with big MOUs with the government at different levels, we've tried to map that down. We felt that this is most useful for practitioners going into the ground and learning about who are all the different players, and therefore who are also the non-state actors present in the field, so to speak. The last theme that we wanted to cover was convergence and complications. And this is an important one, and more so even for nutrition. As you all know, there are multiple different departments that converge together to kind of provide nutrition services on the ground. So one example that I'd like to talk about here is about the National Deworming Day. So for instance, the National Deworming Day is something that is a day that is organized by the Health Department and the WCD department collaboratively. While the Health Department is responsible for providing the tablets, the toolkits, the format for monitoring, the distribution of these tablets happens through the Anganwadi centers. And so therefore, Anganwadi workers are heavily involved. So in fact, the convergence takes place in such a way that actually the Health Department also does training for Anganwadi workers to be able to do this well. And there are multiple examples of convergence that you will find in this space from top to bottom, where different departments are coming together to conduct certain activities on the ground. So these are the 5 themes that we have tried to map out. Avani, do we have time for a quick glimpse at the tool?
I think not. Sorry.
So, yeah. So then over to you, and yeah, so over to you, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Rajika. Rajika showed this. So while part of the discussion, we definitely want to get into the tool itself, but I think today we wanted to kind of zoom out as well and talk a little bit about how often seemingly very complex government structures and systems both enable and constrain service delivery, and again, both within the government, but also from the citizen state lens. Just to share briefly with everyone in the panel in particular, we hosted a series of roundtables with different stakeholders. We had one with government, we had one with CSO and consulting organizations, and one with academic and the research community. And just from some food for thought in some ways that came up from some of the discussions. I think what was one of the feedback that we got is we've had to do this state by state because there are very different structures that exist across states. In fact, some of the discussion was also, even at the district level, there are differences. So the importance of looking at the interstate variations in structures, some states have a lot more devolution, there are new posts, and how they impact service delivery is something that we were requested that could be an interesting area to delve into. Another area I think that came up a number of times is it's interesting that even, and we've seen this with our own eyes, even within the government, often you are so kind of you are so micro into your role and responsibility and those that directly report to you or who you directly report to. But sometimes it's useful again here as well to zoom out and understand the larger context in which you sit, because that also has impact on service delivery. So I may be responsible for ensuring funding, but I don't actually, or ensuring implementation, but if I don't control the financing and that's stuck somewhere else, what can I do about it? So that again came up as something in the roundtable. There was another question of how do you make this data more dynamic in real time? How do you put in real data into this? And that's something that we've been grappling with. Structures change, but more importantly, how do you layer on more and more information to make it even more user-friendly? And I think finally, what does this mean for citizens who are trying to access their entitlements? That was another theme that came up many times during the discussions. So without further ado, I'd like to open it up to the panel and hand over to Yamini to hopefully discuss a little bit on the tool, but some of these larger governance questions as well.
Thank you, Avani, and many congratulations to you, Rajika, and the entire Accountability Initiative team for pulling off this task. As both of you said, back many moons ago when we first started investigating, when we first started actually thinking about the question of accountability and public service delivery, and what it meant from the perspective of citizens who are increasingly in the framework of implementation of social policy, tasked with planning, tasked with monitoring, tasked with holding the state accountable for the delivery of services, whose rights are very much linked to the extent to which they have a clearly defined understanding of how the state is organized and where they can go to place their claims as rights-bearing citizens on the state. One of the big challenges that we confronted was the extent of opacity that existed from a citizen's perspective. The government or the bureaucracy is a complex labyrinth, I think, for all of you, so many of you who are part of government, and for all of us who are outside of government, citizens engaging with government, that labyrinth can be quite daunting, especially when one is trying to push the system to unpack that labyrinth to resolve grievances and respond to claims made by citizens. And in fact, our initial foray into the entire effort at Accountability Initiative of tracking funds came precisely from this, that there is, citizens at the grassroots are expected to make a plan to make the school work better. At that point in time, we were working in education, but we didn't even know which level of government was responsible for what level of function within the framework of Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, which had very nice organograms that sort of broadly told you who the different sort of positions were and who occupied those positions, but within that, who's responsible for what and how do lines of accountability or chains of command actually operate, all of which turned out to be an essential function if you want to be able to, as a citizen, understand what is feasible and what is the best way of, at what level of government can one make rightful claims. What also surprised us at the time in the process of trying to unpack this was how much, particularly at the grassroots, government itself was a little sort of caught in its own opacity. Often the right hand didn't quite know what the left hand was doing. And even though, of course, everybody had a broad sense of who's doing what or what broad responsibilities were, in the complexity of implementation as new schemes were being layered onto a system designed for something quite different, the challenge became quite enormous. And we narrowed down to begin with to track finances, only because funding and decision-making authority tend to be closely intertwined. So it gave a better window into what actually was happening at the grassroots in terms of implementation. And that became a window to better understand from a citizen's perspective how to engage the state. And I think building off of that, we've come a long way to the mapping governance work. I have a sense of how difficult it is to actually build these detailed organograms and make sense of who's doing what, understanding processes within government. So I can imagine how complex and hard it was to get here. So many congratulations and huge kudos to all of you for having pulled this together. This is, of course, the start of what are going to be multiple maps. And these maps are constantly changing. So I think with that, I think let's kick off the discussion. I think the core of what we wanted to talk about in today's panel discussion was really around trying to better understand how bureaucracy sees its own complexity and how it sees the way in which it reaches out to citizens, and to what extent do these complex silos and administrative processes need to be made transparent to enable better citizen administration or citizen-led administration. So I think to begin with, I would request our panelists to offer some opening remarks in response to the effort that Accountability Initiative has put to create these maps, but also your perspective on whether mapping of this nature is a helpful exercise, both in terms of better understanding the complexity of grassroots administration, and can it facilitate a more meaningful deliberation with citizens? So Sourabh, I'm going to start with you. May I request you to give your opening remarks?
Thank you. First of all, I would like to congratulate the Accountability Initiative team and the Center for Policy Research for developing this tool. As I think all of you have already said, it's a complex task, and all credit goes to the team for taking it up. There are 3 or 4 things which especially I think stand out. One is the lens that you have used more from the implementer angle, from the focus of the grassroots person who actually needs to interact with the government. So I think that's a very good lens that you have used. Second is obviously the graphics tool that you have used is more of a visualization tool, a visual tool, and therefore it makes it to some extent language agnostic. And of course, language would be required, but given the fact that it may not be possible to have it in all the regional languages immediately, but the fact that you have a color coding scheme and it gives a fair idea of a person who may not be very fluent in English also to be able to understand. And the third, I think, is obviously that you're using the sector lens again. So the silos which exist within departments, you're looking at ultimately the benefit that goes to a person, and that could be from a variety of departments, and all of that is there. So the sector lenses. And the fourth, if I can put it, is the focus on the social sectors, because perhaps you have some amount of work done by the private sector as far as infrastructure is concerned or economic sectors is concerned, but it's the social sectors where perhaps this kind of work is not there. So I mean, it's excellent. And I can only say that as time goes on, I'm sure it will evolve and people will find it useful. And maybe within government, we don't realize that that people outside the problems that they have in navigating government. So I think this would definitely help in getting a better sense of where government at the grassroots is and what each person does.
Can I ask you a follow-up question? I think one of the big shifts that are underway in government right now is the transition into technology. And by that, I'm not specifically talking about the UID per se, but the overall sort of use of technology as a way to reshape administrative structures and administrative processes. How does one understand this mapping in that context? So, with, for example, the increasing use of DBT, which is sort of shifting the dynamic of the citizen-state interface, the role of the different levels of administration, but at the same time raising very important questions about grievance redressal and points of accountability. So just wanted to hear from you. It's too tempting not to ask you this question, but just wanted to hear from you. How are you as a bureaucrat thinking about this transition? What is it doing to enable perhaps a less complicated governance structure, or maybe it's making it more complicated? And how are you thinking about the citizen-state interface and grievance redressal in that context?
Yeah. See, the objective of various programs and Digital India is one prominent example of the government to ensure that the different touch points that the citizen has with the government, how often they can be made faceless, so that it can be through a medium, for example, through the digital medium, if it can be done. And to that extent, there are both internal processes which have become digitized. You have things like e-office and PFMS, where transfers can happen directly from the government India into the bank accounts, which is the prime example being the DBT schemes. So there are a number of internal processes being done to reduce the number of layers within government, as also to ensure that a citizen should be able to avail the services as far as possible through a digital medium without the need for any physical presence being there. And the fact that connectivity has improved considerably. You have the BharatNet program, you have the other broadband and 3G, 4G and the mobile penetration is really across the country, so it helps all the more. And the increasing use of smartphones also improves the ability to transfer services or use these as mediums for services wherever they can. And I think this is a process that will only continue. The broad objective being ease of living, if I can put it that way. With that objective of ease of living, what can be done? And I can just give you one or two examples, one or two of them being Aadhaar based. For example, during COVID times, the government was able to increase the transfers through DBT by 100% and within 1 year, which would not have been imaginable had the digital means not been there. In fact, the way government schemes are being conceptualized and implemented has transformed because of the digital mechanism that now exists, which was not there even a decade back. Similarly, the need, for example, brick and mortar bank branches has been minimized. I won't say eliminated, but the very fact that you have more than 30 lakh micro ATMs, as they are called, where they're available with any shopkeeper and you can withdraw cash, deposit cash through that means. So with the overall objective of the ease of living, digitization of various services has improved the service delivery, increased information availability. For example, just to give you an example, for agriculture, one is able to send weather alerts so much easier through even SMS messages or smartphones, which was not possible. So with this, perhaps it will enable a lot more people to access services which they were not. But one has to be careful that till smartphones become ubiquitous, we have to enable that services in feature phones. But just one other point I would like to make is that now there are these citizen service centers, CSCs as they're called, and there are nearly 4.5 lakh of them across the country. We have 6.5 lakh villages in the country. And many of them are very small hamlets. They may be in, and we have 4.5 lakh citizen service centers, which is essentially a village entrepreneur, what earlier used to be called an internet cafe, that he has or he or she has a computer which is connected to the internet, and that enables a person who may not be internet savvy, who may not have a smartphone, who may not be savvy in different languages, to be able to utilize the services of this village entrepreneur.
Thanks. There's a lot to unpack there, and we'll come back to this, because I do think the relationship between technology, administration, and citizen is at the heart of many of the challenges and opportunities that we confront in this entire governance process, and it will shape and reshape how Rajika and Avani have been thinking about mapping as well as we go. But Sekhar, can I come to you next for your opening remarks? And also, in some ways, one of the challenges that we had confronted again when we started, and what sort of and the journey that's brought us to mapping, this whole mapping governance exercise, is very deeply anchored in the need to understand process, and that, when we talk about monitoring and evaluation, there is rightly so a lot of focus on output to outcome transitions, but process shapes the nature of the output, and for sure ultimately the outcome. And in many ways, from the citizen's perspective, the process is the outcome. If the process is debilitating, then the outcome becomes somewhat irrelevant. So the act of understanding what level of government I should go to, what level of government is accountable for what level of service, became a very, very important piece of what we felt was important to understand. So, in some ways, what we were trying to do was to put process mapping into the heart of how we think of monitoring. And I know you've thought about this a lot, both in your current role in DMEO, but otherwise as well. So your perspectives on that will be really interesting for us to learn from.
Yeah, thanks, Yamini. At the outset, let me also join Sourabh in congratulating CPR for different things, outstanding things that CPR has done under the accountability initiative, under your leadership, and very young, extremely talented Avani, Rajika, and others. In fact, I've been passing on the post-budget notes on flagship schemes to my staff, and telling them that if we should also come up with that level of granular details, in the notes that we share inside the government. So it's interesting. I just came back from a meeting with ISP colleague, where jokingly I said, you think government is intimidating? I also think sitting in government, navigating government can be equally intimidating. So I think this whole black box, there are so many elegant solutions. Everyone keeps talking about it, but why don't they get implemented in the field? I think there's one big black box of government itself, the implementation that you talked about. There is also a design issue. Design has to consider the implementation, which leads inputs into activities and outputs. Then the other big black box is the socio-political sort of vague economy that we are talking about, where intra-household gender relationships, extra-household caste, and many other things together. All these black box things ultimately end up in the same scheme being resulting in different outputs and outcomes, and across different districts, in different villages in the same block. So there's so much of granularity and difference. So I think you are up to something which can really, really help in unraveling this, at least one black box of what is this government about. So you have already figured out there are 5 or 6 different elements to it, and you're putting So I think this can be a very critical tool for unraveling government. This is my always an issue. There's so much of research very far away from the reality of governance, where the rubber hits the road. Maybe it is too rustic for academicians to come in, but this is where the life is going to be changing. Improving the quality of governance. So I think this is very, very critical work. And I just hope, it's slowly over a period of time, it becomes a sophisticated tool for researchers to conduct their research. So each element of whatever you're doing is a very critical part of understanding the black box, this huge monster that we keep talking about. So in that context, I really feel you are up to something big. I also hope that it can be interactive. For example, you say that, okay, money from here to there, how does it go? Then this interactive tool can probably map it out and tell what's happening. So then coming back, clearly when we evaluate programs and projects, clearly design is an important issue. We also keep talking a lot about implementation, and we do qualitative research, and still I think there's so much more that needs to be done. And it's very interesting that you highlighted some of these factors which conceptually I think are so fundamental. Decentralization, empowerment, ultimately who can make the services work? People who have, one thing that human civilization, one principle that has worked is if it's aligned with their self-interest, it will work. That's how markets work. So who have the biggest benefit in it? It's the end users, mothers, children, the villagers. So I think finally, I think that's the direction in which we want to move. And somewhere, if we can figure out, in which context this level of empowerment of the villagers or the end users exists, and how you can manage different complex nuts of the bureaucracy to make it happen. There again, I figure I definitely feel that there's a lot more that this tool can provide. Just to flag some points at this stage, I've been quite thinking deeply. Why don't our money end up in the type of outcomes that we want to deliver? And to some extent, our inputs, to some extent, where the implementation is okay, we deliver outputs. But somehow outputs doesn't lead to type of outcomes. We talk about learning outcome failure. We have invested so much in infrastructure, teacher training. So there, I think this whole lot of outcomes that we are looking at is change in human behavior. So it deeply involves behavioral change. I don't think government alone can be a tool to manage it. We really need external ecosystem support. This is where communities come into play, self-help groups come into play. So that is something that the government really has to work. So how can some of these elements be brought into your research? So you have this arrangement, but how is this internal arrangement working with the external ecosystem to deliver the type of outcomes? The other point you have talked, I think it's extremely critical, is convergence. So how can nutrition, education, women's empowerment, these are all multiple departments have to converge on a single household. So yeah, I think your tool really highlights a lot of them. Then this whole dimension of getting civil servants, civil society on board. Then clearly, this is all extremely complex. But do you think that we really need to have this complexity? I think that's fundamentally we should ask. We want to deliver outcomes. Bureaucracy and systems are a process to achieve it, and we have ended up in such complex mechanisms. So I think the research is how do we get over it, and I think there are two different types of services where it is putting cash in the hands of the end user. Technology has immensely worked it out. Where we want to deliver in-kind services like Anganwadi or school, I think that's where I think we haven't yet fully figured out what we need to, what can be done. So in a way, I'm just laying out few things here. Maybe I'll come back later. The point I want to make it is, I think it's a great beginning. It has huge potential. Because often I keep hearing that there's elegant solutions outside. It is this horrible, government which doesn't have capacity and insensitive and can't do it. The truth is that's not true. There are lots of people who want to do it, but we need to change. Some of it is by simplification. Some of it is by building on external strengths of external ecosystem. So I think your research, your tool probably will help us move in that direction. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. That was a very, very, I think it's very gratifying for us to hear this from all of you, actually, given, as outsiders looking into a system, we see its complexity from a certain perspective, and often wonder whether that complexity is better. The challenges that we are confronting, are these a consequence of lack of knowledge or lack of engagement, and how these can be put to use. So it's really very gratifying to know that from all of you that you see some value in this and its possibilities, both as citizens. I think we see, or rather as engaged researchers, we see some value in this, but it's very important for us to understand your perspectives. Anjali, can I turn to you next you have been at the heart of of pushing for more transparency and as central to what shapes the ability or empowers citizens to place claims, accountability claims on the state. And you have, in more than anyone, have encountered the big black hole of administration in some ways. Where do you go? How do you go? And through the RTI movement, particularly in the attempt on public disclosure, Section 4, trying to push some version of mapping governance to make it more transparent, more accessible, more responsive to what citizens need. So we were very keen to get your perspective on how you see this exercise, how it sits within the larger the larger push for greater transparency, and particularly in the framework of the right to information, and how we as citizens can better can sort of use this to better engage with government. So very keen to hear from you.
Thank you, Yamini, and thank you, Avani, for having me here. And let me begin by congratulating both Accountability Initiative and CPR for this initiative. Rajika walked us through some of the very important aspects of the mapping, and I think that there is tremendous potential in a tool like this in empowering people. Yamini, like you mentioned, I have been involved with work at the grassroots, and I think one of the most important things that we have learned is that if we want to move anywhere towards a participatory, meaningful democracy, the one thing that would empower people to truly participate and engage is if they know and if they have information and if they can actually map out the system and the process. And which is why I think that this is a very, very important initiative. Of course, I am going to talk about some of my experiences from the ground, and where I hope that Accountability Initiative and CPR will take this as well. So, when I heard about this mapping initiative, the first thing I was reminded of how when in Delhi, the right to information law was passed, and we went to the slums and we told people that there's this fantastic law, you must use it. A woman stood up in the meeting and she said, "Ration to milta nahi hai, सूचना का क्या करेंगे? We don't get our rations. What are we going to do with information?" And so we naturally asked her, "Why don't you get your rations? You have a ration card. What is the problem?" And she said that the shopkeeper tells us that our share of ration has not been sent by the government. So we asked her, we said that, "Have you ever gone and complained? Have you ever talked to anyone within the government?" And, she looked so surprised at the question at two levels. And there were two responses that she gave. One was, she said, "Do you know how intimidating it is for us to go into that system? And then when we go to that office, we are asked, tell us the name of the official you want to meet. Tell us the designation, at least, of the official that you want to meet. And we have absolutely no idea what to say. So leave alone, depositing our complaint, we are almost made to feel like we've done something wrong by reaching there." The second thing that she said was that, well, actually, it's all right. It's government money. So if it's government's rations. So if they're not giving it, I guess there is not very much that we can do. And, this simple example, or really the experience that we had, shows us how the whole system, when we talk about citizen empowerment, how not having that information, not knowing how to navigate the system, can really disempower people. And despite having very elaborate schemes, programs, and now, of course, there is the food security law as well, people are left out of the benefits and the social security and food net that is meant for them, if they don't have the kind of information that is required to empower the person, the last person, to be able to demand their rights and to be able to hold whoever is in the system accountable if they are not getting their rights. Even during COVID, the Delhi government, because I work extensively in Delhi, the Delhi government started this scheme called the e-coupon scheme. And this was meant for people who don't have ration cards. Now, it was a very extensive scheme finally, because, the matter went to court and so on. But finally, the government gave rations to 70 lakh people. Now, out of 1.4 crore people in Delhi, or 2 crore people in Delhi, 70 lakh people have ration cards, and the government gave rations to 70 more lakh people through e-coupons. But the problem was that we had scores of people coming to us and saying, "I'm not able to get rations. I am really requiring ration. I've lost my livelihood, but I don't know where to go. And I don't know whether I'm supposed to get rations." Now, there was no place where the list of beneficiaries or who is supposed to get the rations was there. And when we asked for the list of beneficiaries, we asked who in the government, people would go to the food department, and the food department was very clear. They said that we are not implementing this. This is being done through schools. Now, when people would go to the education department, they would be told, "Look, we are only implementing, we don't have any information as such." RTI applications were filed, in response to which finally people were told that there is a Janta Samvad team, which is running this from the Chief Minister's office, because they wanted to give it particular attention. But finally, what was happening was that those who could not access the entitlement had nowhere to turn to, and either file a complaint in the right place where they could get time-bound delivery of what they needed at that time, nor could they get the kind of information that they were looking for. So I think that if we have systems of the kind that we are looking at, they could go a very long way. And I mean, there are so many examples. I remember in Swaminagar, there was a basti that was getting demolished, and people went to the MCD slum and JJ department, which used to take care of demolitions in Delhi. And in the middle of everything One fine day, people were told you're at the wrong place. You're not dealing with the right department at all. Because the Legislative Assembly of Delhi, and this was, in the early 2000s, the Legislative Assembly of Delhi has passed a DUSIB law. So this is the Delhi Urban Shelter Improvement Board, and now that is where you need to go if you have any problems, or you have a grievance, or you need to ask anything. So people kept running from pillar to post. They did not even get a copy of the DUSIB law till they filed an RTI application. Now, what I'm really sort of getting at is that for people to navigate the system, to be able to access their rights, to be able to really hold the system accountable, unless this kind of mapping exists and it is there for the last person to access, we don't see much hope. We have constantly been saying, and it's very much part of the RTI law, Section 4 talks about, one of the purposes of the law was to really put out this kind of information. The law says it has to be put out in the most accessible local language, most accessible manner, where, the kind of organograms that Rajika walked us through, who's responsible for what is the name of the official who has to be, approached, what are their roles and responsibilities, so that people actually know where to reach, what is the fund flow, again, like you mentioned, a lot of people don't know what is, a lot of people don't know how to read budgets, but they don't know where the money is coming, how much money is coming in a year, where it is being spent. And in fact, one of the slogans of the RTI movement was Hamara Paisa, Hamara Hisab, because unless they have that granular information, nothing makes sense. It's, we've had the experience where people have filed RTI applications to the municipal corporation. And when they asked for the public works that were done, 70% of the works in a year were P/L of CCR. Now, we actually had to sit with an engineer in the MCD to understand what P/L of CCR means. And finally, we realized it was providing and laying cement concrete roads. Now, when we are mystifying things to that level, where, even when people access information, they don't really understand it because it's all in a language that is not meant for them, we have a huge problem. And finally, I'm going to stop with saying that, it's important to also recognize that there is still a huge digital divide, and it also exists at a gender level. We've had so many studies which have shown that women have so much less access to technology, to smartphones, and so on. So what I feel that would be very useful is that, of course, this is something that needs to be done either by the government or in collaboration with the government as well, because the scale of it would be so huge. But one of the things that we've consistently said, and which was also part of the grievance redress bill, which was there in Parliament, unfortunately never got legislated, was that there should be information and facilitation centers, which are very decentralized, where these kind of mapping initiatives can actually speak to people, where they can go and ask that, can you tell me who I should approach for my pensions? There are different eligibilities, there are different departments dealing with old age pensions and widow pensions and handicapped pensions, where people can go and understand this very complex system that exists. And this typical feeling that I will go somewhere and मैं अर्जी लगाऊंगी so it'll just go into a black hole. That, whether it is an arzi for an entitlement that I'm supposed to get, or a right I'm supposed to get, or it is a grievance that I'm not getting that right. And I think that the first step, of course, is having this information in one place. And I think going forward, the next step has to be to have it in local languages, and then finally to also have it in a manner which is most accessible to people. We recognize the importance of technology, but finally it comes down to how appropriate is the technology that is also being used to put across that information to people. Would it make most sense for them to just have it on a board, as a wall painting, or not a smartphone, which most families which live below the poverty line wouldn't have, but even on a feature phone which would have far deeper penetration, to just send an SMS about all of this information. So I'll stop there and just congratulate you again on this initiative. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anjali, and especially for bringing in the grassroots perspective, the struggles that citizens have in trying to navigate this complex landscape of government. And I think that there are two sort of separate but interrelated issues that are emerging from what you said. And Sourabh, I'd like to start with you just to get your sense of this, and also picking up on some of the questions that have come. At one level, there is just a sheer complexity of how government is organized. It begs the larger question of, does it need to be this complex? But in that complexity is another reality, which even a mapping governance kind of project like this is unable to always capture. There is a de jure reality of how it's supposed to be, and then there is the de facto of how it ends up being. There's a lot of informal processes, systems that unfold. In fact, one of the reasons why at Accountability we started tracking fund flows is because whatever was said on paper, the reality is the core decision making is made where monies arrive and where authority to spend rests. So in some ways, the panchayat may have lots of functions allocated to it, but if there is no fund there, then it's actually at the district education officer or the CMO that is making the core decisions. So how do we move from this question of it's complex on paper, even de jure, the de facto is even more difficult to unpack. And what does this mean then, both from a very selfish perspective for a project like this that is limited in some ways to what is de jure and is trying to map it out? And how should we, and can we push the debate further on whether simplification, so we talk about ease of simplification very often in the context of ease of business. How much simplification can we have? It's not so much about paperwork simplification, which is sort of the right to services kind of simplification, but just administrative processes. Can those be made more simple for decisions to be taken fast? And then the second piece, which I'll come to maybe in the next round of our conversation, is on grievance redressal, which I think is at the heart of a lot of all of this. So
but before I just go on the simplification piece, just wanted to add one or two things on the digital piece, and what is the level of penetration. We have around 130 odd crore people. Obviously 99.9% of adults have Aadhaar, so it's universal, more or less. We have 140 crore bank accounts. Obviously, people might have duplicate more than one bank account, so everyone. But the kind of penetration that has happened because of Jan Dhan Yojana, where you had 45 crore bank accounts onboarded, that shows what level. But obviously, there are still constraints. And the other fact which I just wanted to mention was the fact that we have 120 crore mobiles in the country. Again, there would be duplicates and others. And out of that, 80 crore are smartphones. So again, there would be duplication. There would be people at the bottom end who would not be having feature. But I just wanted to place that the digital divide that we talk of is there, but it may not be of the magnitude that was there maybe even a decade back. So I just wanted to place that fact. Coming to the simplification, I think that's really been the focus. If you look at the past decade or so, for example, affidavits were done away with and everything was done on a self-declaration basis. One of the components of ease of doing business is how to reduce the number of forms that have to be submitted and the number of compliances that have to be done by various businesses. The Shram, the labor acts or the labor code also focuses on that. There is no doubt there's a lot of ground to cover, but I think the basic intent and the objective of the government is on simplification and how maximum can be done without visiting an office, which could not be conceived of even maybe a decade back when you had much lesser penetration of mobiles or internet, but can at least be considered. Look at PDS, the One Nation, One Ration card, which has been enabled that a person might have the ration card, let's say in UP somewhere, but he or she can access the PDS through Mumbai itself because of the Aadhaar linkages there are. And we have the digital infrastructure in place to be able to implement a lot of the programs by nationally, given the Aadhaar. I'm not putting a pitch for Aadhaar out here, but all I'm saying is that the Aadhaar provides the digital rails for the implementation of things like the UPI, things like the One Nation, One Ration card. Obviously, at the ground level, the delivery of services depends on the human being at that point. But I think the level of changes that have occurred and the pace of change that has occurred in the past decade or so has been made possible by the use of technology, and that will only increase as we go ahead. And the ability of citizens to be able to seek redressal is much, much higher, without getting into the fact that we need to continue to improve than where we are, that through a phone, you can actually send complaints, you can access, and I think where the real work needs to be done is on actually getting the awareness and the information to the people. The delivery of services has improved considerably, and I'm talking about the core services, if I can put, whether it's health, it's education, and food. If you look that as the basic three minimum that are required for survival, the kind of improvements that have happened, different states have taken different models and mechanisms for doing that. But sure, we have a considerable way to go, but I think it's the intent that is very important.
So let me just sort of bridge two things together, and Sekhar, get your perspective from the sort of monitoring and evaluation framework as well. We have layered on, as Sourabh has sort of very very articulately described, the digital infrastructure with the objective of both simplification and moving, kind of pushing, creating a context where perhaps the citizen doesn't need to reach the state, doesn't need to go to the physical structure of the state as such to access services of the state. But there are two questions here, which is, in some senses, the digital infrastructure requires a state to be able to be sophisticated in its response, in its ability to manage that infrastructure. How much has that shifted? So from a mapping governance point of view, are we seeing a shift in the human resource infrastructure that is needed to be able to enable that digital infrastructure to effectively function. And from what you all have been tracking a large number of schemes, from what you are learning about implementation of schemes on the ground, how has the citizen-state interface shifted? Is it that because in some senses, when you're confronted with a digital infrastructure, often just like we keep calling up the call center, and the call center keeps putting us on hold. Are we confronting a digital state as citizens when programs are being implemented, or does it confront a human and digital state? So your perspectives on what you're learning from the ground on how these interfaces are working.
Yeah, I would like to go with what Sourabh had mentioned. I think our understanding about what's happening has a lag period. The type of digital adoption that's taking place, even just look at NFHS 4 and 5, it specifically asks questions about women's sole access to digital phones and bank account. Bank accounts, close to 80% of women have reported, which is 25 basis points higher than NFHS 4, saying that they have the account, they operate it themselves. So it's not about a household having it. But there's a wide variation. India has such huge variation. So clearly, there are lots of pockets where we need to do a lot more work to catch up. Likewise, in digital application also, what we find sitting here is different ministries have different levels of digital capabilities. I think Ministry of Rural Development, Ministry of Earth Sciences, these are, I think some of the programs are global class, our food and public distribution system, the level, given the level, our payment systems, I think even some of the most advanced countries don't have some of these capabilities. So and I'm just trying to figure out, why in these different ministries there is different levels of capabilities. Some are really, really bad. I'm telling you on a scale of 0 to 5. There are some ministries which are like 4.6, 4.7 when we did internal scoring of their IT systems. Some are 0.5, extremely laggard. So one thing I am figuring, I felt like where there is a lot of external pressure, accountability, like Ministry of Rural Development. I think the government also starts responding to these external pressures. So it's very important, as you said, that citizen, sometimes citizens who really want these services are the people who are most disempowered, illiterate, struggling, extremely vulnerable. So they need some intermediation. Clearly, it's the Panchayati Raj or self-help groups or some activist or someone talking for them. And when someone talks for them, whether it's political executives or some system, I think the government locally, whether it is at the Panchayat level or different levels, respond. So clearly, if we can, so in coming back, it's very difficult to answer any question in yes or no. India has so much of shades. And I think that's also something that a digital technology can also help. Now we have information about hundreds of indicators up to district level, NFHS 5. So can we figure out some geographical patterns to this? If you look at most of the India's significantly backward or challenging parts are the tribal belts. Covering the most advanced states like Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh. So even in Madhya Pradesh, we think Maharashtra, we think it's an advanced state, but some of their rural areas are as bad. The rural distress is as bad as other parts. So I think we need to figure out, and we have to get down into more granularity. Coming to this whole issue, it's good to understand this complexity, but I think we as researchers or responsible citizens of this country, our Raja focus should be to deliver the type of outcomes we want to the most marginalized, and build maybe not accountability, empower the system. Accountability has a little bit of negative connotation that people are not willing to do it. So we want to, from top, we want to make it happen. The truth is, ultimately, it's the community in the village who really, they are the end beneficiary. So how do we empower them through information, but also tools where they can also have this self-realization, about what is happening. So that's where I think the monitoring and evaluation are not the tools for some central agency sitting in Delhi to decide. It has to be a tool at every stage for that type of self-awareness, empowerment, and also decision-making. So that means this capacity has to go to the lowest level, whether it is census or statistical, but also figuring out which are the key outcomes. So then how do we bring this, how do we tame this complexity to deliver these outcomes? I think it has to be convergence. And the convergence has to be around outcomes. And somewhere we have to measure outcomes, and we have to map out who can deliver these outcomes. It's not just government. It is households are doing huge amount of work. It's also private sector. It's also so many others are trying to do it. So how can different streams, just like the mapping that you have done, what are the pathways to deliver those outcomes, and how can we, as a society, manage it? One last point I would like to say and then close. Technology, most of the other things I think will take, they need time, like whether building capacity, changing cultural mores and other stuff. What is something which can pivot our society quickly is technology. I know that it has huge amount of limitations. We have to work on digital inclusiveness and so forth. But I think this is one force which has ability to transform. So one example I want to give is, where as a helpless end user, just illiterate parents, their kids, I think that's the most vulnerable situation. They're aspirational, they want to move up, but the parents don't have that capacity to navigate. So the first stage is getting that entitlement. So I am from a tribal family. I'm eligible for scholarship. Now you have to figure out 100 ways, and I think that's why you have this thick middle layer to navigate this complex system, this whole Panchayat Raj and so forth. I think the technology can pivot by saying that we will figure out through central algorithms and data and tell us who are eligible, and then there's no need for application. Automatically it will happen. And this social registry, Aadhaar, I think is a extremely great foundation stone that we have with some sort of social registry and classifying households. And when the scheme is announced, the governments will say that this is meant for 10%, this is meant for 20%. And we have digital systems to say, and no one needs to apply. So in a way, across the world, people are saying that government systems can't deliver. So maybe we should have universal basic income transfers. And I think we are doing it, Kisan, PM Kisan, and so many other transfers that we have done. But that's also not alone enough. We need to also have in kind. We need our teachers to train. We need student scholarships and many other things. So this is where I figure out, technology can have a huge opportunity to navigate this complexity. So we understand this complexity, but also we figure out solutions to pivot, jump over this complexity rather than trying to, figure out how to handle it. So coming back to technology solutions, I think we also have taken a very good path. Most of it is in the private sector, the backbone of provision. Whether it is by and large, they seem to. We need to make sure that markets, especially, operate well in this space. And of course, wherever there is the policy interventions, wherever there is lower coverage, you have mechanisms to transfer more resources. BharatNet and others are supposed to help. Where things are not happening as quickly as we would like to, but I think the focus is there. So in a way, we have the backbone, we have ability. Now, it's up to all of us to sit down and figure out to make sure that we deliver the type of outcomes our citizens deserve in a manner where they don't need to run for pillar to post, and it's delivered at their doorstep.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I'm going to ask Sourabh one more question, and then I'll come to you, Anjali, for the last word before we close. This issue of convergence has come up quite often in our conversations, and in fact, I think quite a few times when Rajika and Avani have been sharing the mapping, the question of this is a silo-driven system. How do you build convergence? And will convergence help simplify comes up repeatedly. But I'm curious about one thing. Can you actually have convergence at the grassroots or the cutting edge of where services are delivered when the entire structure of delivery is siloed into these ministerial structures? So from an administrator's perspective, is that can we actually work kind of like you have 10 lines and suddenly 10 fingers and then suddenly it becomes one number 10 at the grassroots? Is that even a viable ambition? Because really, in so many ways, the need for this mapping comes from the fact that the silos of the top get replicated at the bottom. So just curious what your thoughts on the big bad convergence argument is.
Yeah, so I would say for administrative convenience, you have the different departments, and perhaps it's a necessity because the kind of width of scope, despite having such departments, is much higher than one would experience in any private sector or different organization, because the mandate of any particular department is so wide. So while it sounds very good to be able to merge departments, but you need to take into account human capability to be able to manage the width of scope that is required at different levels. Having said that, the way a lot of the convergence can come up, and which is what happens, is you have, as it called in classic management parlance, that you have a matrix structure, that you have functional departments, and then cross-cutting you have at different levels. And the district is one typical example, that the district magistrate or the chief executive of the district has a parallel running jurisdiction over the functional departments, which might be 100 of 70 or 100 of them. And similarly, at the block level, you have typically in most states, the BDO, again, having that cross-cutting responsibility. We perhaps have not reached the stage that at the panchayat level, at the gram panchayat level, the gram panchayat to some extent has that, because in different states, depending on 25 functions, 27 functions, 30 functions have been delegated. And that's where the cross-cutting convergence will come from. So it has to be a mix of functional specialization for administrative convenience, and then building on a matrix structure to have some kind of convergence through formal means, which is the district magistrate, BDO, and GP. And then the informal means, where you can have groups of people in one sector. Just to give, for example, to give an example of the agriculture sector, which I am familiar, given my past experience, at the grassroots level, at the village level, we asked for a weekly meeting of the agriculture officer, of the fisheries officer, of the livestock inspector, of the cooperatives person in charge, so that that convergence and the minor irrigation, the lift irrigation person, and the marketing inspector, so that we can have informal institutional mechanisms built in to bring about that convergence. But I think it's a utopian idea to expect one person at the ground level to be able to deliver all the services. That person won't have the expertise, functional expertise, or the ability to manage such a wide width of areas.
Thank you. Anjali, to you from a citizen's perspective, We've spoken about the complexity of the system. We've spoken about the role of technology in potentially simplifying, potentially creating opportunities. And there are also, of course, critical challenges around the digital divide, of inclusion, the big question of grievance redressal, possibilities of converging, but as Sourabh rightly says, it will never be converged into one unit. There will always be a multiplicity of silos given the complexity of the state. So from a citizen's perspective, how does one further navigate this in a way that makes it more accessible, less daunting, and more visible and in ways visible in relevant ways to citizens, so that the core of democracy is claim making on the state, that core is preserved in a complex system which will always be complex?
Yes, Yamini, I think all of us here agree that the reason why this sort of a mapping exercise is so important and is so powerful is because finally what we need is citizenry, is people who are informed, who understand, and are therefore able to successfully navigate these systems, which might, of course, be very complex, and are able to actually hold them accountable at their own level without having to necessarily reach the courts, which we know most people in our country can't. I think it's a very important point and very well taken that given the size of our country, the population, the geographic spread, it would perhaps be very difficult to imagine just one sort of a stream managing and implementing everything. But I think the challenge here is to see how there can be at least convergence in terms of the information that exists and how people are informed. And there could be convergence in finally some system of accountability. So even when we talk about the grievance redress mechanisms, they certainly should be such that they are citizen friendly, where a person goes and doesn't have to run around various offices to say, well, today I did not get my old age pension, so I'll have to run around to 10 different places to try and see where my complaint will be registered. So the mechanism has to be such that it is easily accessible to people at that point. The reality is that technology is very empowering and including smartphones for people who own them or can use them or have access to them. Sekhar talked about the National Family Health Survey, and I was just reminded, the NFHS 5 actually has a figure which really struck me. It said only 1 in 3 women have ever used the internet. Now, to my mind, when we are planning systems and we are putting out information, that is a statistic that we can't avoid. And when we talk about a mechanism by which we use technology, which could be computerization, which could be having a large database and so on, that should not be such that it makes that person feel disempowered. I mean, I'll give you a very small example. In one of the meetings, a woman came and she was very distraught. She said, the unimaginable has happened. Mera ration card computer mein band ho gaya. So we were very struck. We said, what does that mean? She said, no, this is the response I've got to my RTI application. It says, aapka ration card computer mein band hai. Now, it's a fact that, for her, she's not able to conceive how this technology is working and at what level is her ration card then stuck and she's unable to get her rations. Again, when we think about direct benefit transfers, and they're very important, like even if there are not things that we agree on entirely, but most of us will agree that scholarships, pensions, they can't, there is no alternative but to provide cash transfers to people in these cases. But the experience of people in going to a bank, accessing a bank, but then also just dealing with that infrastructure, it can be very daunting. And I mean, this entire thing about technology, I feel that it's important to constantly think that how is it impacting the person that we intend should benefit from that. So there was a time where this was a claim that was made that 4 crore bogus ration cards were discovered using technology and Aadhaar. And finally, I mean, in a place like Delhi, what we found was that people said that our ration card was found to be bogus because if you went 3 times to your ration shop and your point of sale device did not work, which means either your biometric didn't work or your point of sale device was not functioning due to lack of connectivity or something, it registered as this is a dead card. This is a bogus card. Nobody's using it. Whereas people said, we went there, we queued up, and for hours, but nothing happened. So I think that finally, the mechanisms, the system has to take into account the people that the government needs to reach out to. I mean, I'm repeating that we certainly don't want to go to a system where we say databases are bad, where we want to say that technology should not be used, but appropriate technology which actually reaches and is accessible to people is what we want to focus on. And in the grievance redress discussions that we have had, the accountability discussions we've had, the citizens charter, what all should it include, and making it known to people whose responsibility is what are the funds that are finally available, become really important. One of the important things that constantly came up was automatic escalation. Somebody might go and file a complaint which doesn't get redressed. Then do we expect that person to again lose their daily wage and go and escalate that complaint 1 month from then? Can't there be a technological fix within the government which would automatically take their complaint to the next level? So I think that these are the conversations that we need to focus on as we move. And again, which is why I said that this mapping exercise is very, very crucial. And we need to think of ways of taking it to a level where more and more people find this accessible, because this is very important. We used to run a small Suchna Ghar, like a little information center. And I can't tell you the number of people who used to flock to that Suchna Ghar because they said, we get to know who to approach, what we are supposed to get. And I think that if these kind of mapping initiatives can find their way, to the decentralized panchayat offices at ward levels in urban areas, that would be very, very valuable. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anjali. So perhaps there's a world in which the common service centers could be a space for presenting the governance maps to citizens who come there, that perhaps the grievance redressal systems should also be integrated with the maps of governance. Avani and Rajika, that's a very strong case for the relevance of these maps and the possible future that they can have. So let me hand back to you and just say a very, very big thank you on my behalf to all the panelists for what's been a very, very insightful and interesting conversation, and also very gratifying to know that perhaps there is some value to this exercise. Avani, back to you.
Well, thank you all so much. As Yamini said, it almost started, the exercise started literally when we were trying to understand this for ourselves. And it's so encouraging to know that it's useful both, as Anjali, you said, for citizens where information itself is such a prized commodity and missing to a large degree, but also for government at different levels. And I think lots for us to think about, even in terms of how does the structure change given the potential of technology and what it does to the different administrative levels. So big thank you to all of you. I think we're all now charged to do this more and find a way to reach the common service centers as well. Big thank you, Yamini, Yamini as well. You were with us when we began this journey of trying to unpack and follow the money, and it was only fitting for you to now be in the center of trying to launch the culmination of our research in a dynamic tool, as it were. I'd also like to thank the attendees. I think we've got a lot of food for thought in some of the questions and suggestions that have come up of we've been talking about technology, how can we think of an app that could be used for, where all, of course, languages is something that Mr. Garg also spoke about. So thank you all for insightful suggestions, and we're going to try and see how many of them we can get on board. And finally, I think I'd like to end with a big congratulations to our state colleagues who have literally gone with pen and paper trying to document this. So we used to do this exercise of trying to map it via guidelines, and of course, but the vetting of that exercise required actually sitting with different Sarkari Adhikari, trying to make sense of it. And then especially when there was divergence of how do you kind of triangulate that information and verify and vet. So big thank you to all our state colleagues. And of course, to the team that put this together in Delhi as well, Amna, Siddharth, and of course, Rajika. Big congratulations to all of you as well. And thank you so much.